Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of VENDO Velocity. We're super happy that you decided to join us today. If this is your first time joining us, I am Delaney Del Mundo, your host, and I lead our Amazon and TikTok shop strategy teams here at VENDO. VENDO Velocity is our live podcast that goes live every other week on Tuesdays to discuss the latest platform updates and strategic recommendations across Amazon, Walmart, TikTok shop, paid search and social, retail media, you name it. We're probably talking about it here in the Amazon, Walmart, TikTok shop space and all things advertising. So today I've brought on a special guest, Jamie Grossman, who's going to chat with us about Amazon Marketing Cloud. It's been a hot topic in the Amazon space over the last few years now, but we're really excited to discuss how we are leveraging it strategically and how you as a brand should be taking advantage of it as well. But before we go ahead and dive into our topics, I'd love for everyone to meet Jamie and for him to go through a bit more of an introduction as far as what he does and what he manages here at VENDO, since it's been probably over a year since he's joined me here on VENDO Velocity. Jamie.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. First off, Delaney, thank you for having me. I'm Jamie Grossman. I'm an advertising specialist here at Vendo. Work very closely on the PPC side as well as the DSP side, and obviously with those two, kind of using AMC to kind of paint the picture just with the interaction between the two. And it's obviously a big topic for us and a big point of strategy. And so excited to dive in, excited to be back. I think it has been almost a year, maybe a little bit more than that. So plenty to kind of catch up on.
Yes, absolutely. And Jamie is just crushes it every single day with some of our top brands on the Amazon space. So very excited to pick his brain here on all things advertising and specifically Amazon Marketing Cloud. So Jamie, for those who aren't deeply familiar with AMC or Amazon Marketing Cloud, can you just go over how you would describe it to someone in layman terms at a very high level?
Yeah, it can be pretty complicated, but AMC is essentially Amazon's advanced analytics tool and audience creation tool. And that's basically what we use it for. We can pull pretty detailed reports and kind of like I mentioned earlier, specifically reports that kind of show the interaction between all different advertising strategies and types. As well as we can get pretty granular with certain audience creation, which obviously in DSP we can do quite a bit, but AMC kind of gives you that extra level of detail, which we found super helpful with a lot of our accounts there. But that's kind of the basic summary for anyone who wouldn't know what that is.
Awesome. And can you talk about just the evolution of AMC specifically? I know over the past year, year and a half, it's evolved quite a bit with just accessibility and what kind of coding background you maybe need to successfully build these queries. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So initially with AMC, knowing how to code and make queries was a huge part of it. And that's why it was kind of limited in terms of the scalability of it, at least like what we've seen here at Vendo. It's very difficult to pull the right queries and get the right reports when you're writing code manually. But what we've seen over time is Amazon has implemented kind of easier parts for us to do that with like templated audiences, templated reports. And more recently, they've actually launched an AI query generator, which that's been super helpful because now we can actually, in very simple terms, type in what we want. And usually Amazon can give us a pretty close result there in terms of that reporting and those audience creation.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about that specifically on the topic of AI because it seems that everything that Amazon is doing now is being influenced by AI, which of course makes sense because that's where the world is going. But how is AI being used to build smarter audiences? And then can you just give examples of maybe whether those AI built audiences perform any better or worse than a typical audience that you would create not using AI?
Mhm. Yeah, 100%. So I would say, first off, with the templated audiences, we were a little bit more limited in what we could do there. So, for example, we could create an audience of people who have viewed our PDPs multiple times. And that's as like specific as we can get. We can kind of determine how many times it is. So 2 times, 3 times, whatever it may be. With the AI, we can specifically make that audience based on people who viewed PDPs from specific ad types as well. So, for example, people who clicked on sponsored products or people who were exposed to DSP, those display banner ads, right? So that's how we could get a little bit more granular with it. And it does help from a retargeting perspective. And so, for example, like something that we're testing out right now is anyone who has clicked or viewed on sponsored brands, right? And retargeting them through this AI audience creation. It's been very successful so far. And we have seen that from a ROAS perspective, it is 2 to 3 times higher, at least with our initial testing, than what we usually get on just like a sponsored products ad, for example, because it kind of factors in that retargeting aspect. And we know how important it is to, frequency is huge within the advertising space. And so the more we hit people and the more we kind of drag them down the funnel to that conversion path, that's going to get us the best returns from a ROAS perspective.
Yeah, that's great insight there. I want to talk a little bit based off of what you just said there on generality versus specificity, because I think a lot of brands are more hesitant to even dive into AMC because they think they get too intimidated. So I'd love to understand, as far as the specific queries, how much does that differ brand by brand versus how much are there a set of queries that are pretty much applicable to any brand you use within a given category?
Yeah, that's the great thing about AMC is we can make it as complicated or as simple as we want it to be. And I think from a very simple level, it does apply to every brand. So, for example, some of the template audiences might be cart abandoners, which is obviously a high value audience for any brand. When you get to kind of the bigger brands and the brands that are running a bit more of intense awareness initiatives, that's where you get a lot more specific. So like targeting frequency on a streaming TV campaign, for example, that's where we could get a little bit more granular and make the audience a little bit more complicated there, both from a targeting perspective and from a negation perspective, right? And like specifically with streaming TV, the negation portion is very important for us, because the whole point there is to expand your reach as much as possible. So through AMC, we can also negate people who have been exposed, let's say 5 to 7 times, and make sure that we're only hitting new audiences. But that would be kind of a more complicated build out, and we would definitely have to use the AI to kind of help us build that specific type of audience. But from a templated perspective, yes, like I think it applies to every brand. And at Vendo, we run it with all of our brands, specifically those template audiences.
Awesome. Yeah, I also love how Amazon is starting to revamp a lot of their tools within Seller Central specifically to account for some of the changes they're making in AMC. Like, for example, they more recently launched a couple months ago a customer loyalty analytics tool directly in brand analytics, which allows you to see how big your audience is for add to carts versus cart abandoners, etc. So you could really see the drop off in your add to cart rate, and then you could see through implementing these audiences in ANC, through implementing brand tailored promotions, how that changes overall. So they're getting a lot more enhanced with the data, which we'll talk about in a second here. But before we do that, Jamie, I do want to just touch on any limitations to the AI that you've seen thus far. Have there been any, or how have you enjoyed using it?
Yeah, in terms of limitations, I mean, we always have to double check that the queries they're spitting out are correct, because sometimes they're not, and we do have to make kind of our own adjustments there. Specifically, what we're trying to do is test review retargeting. So people who have left reviews on a certain product and then potentially retarget them with an ad from another product, for example, within our catalog. And we have been running into some issues there. I do believe it's possible for us to do it, and we have been in contact with Amazon, and they seem to think it's possible as well. But that's the thing about the AI is it's brand new, so we have to do a lot of cross-referencing, double checking. I personally use ChatGPT to kind of explain the code to me because I'm not an expert by any means in coding. But for the most part, I think from a simple audience perspective, it's usually correct. When you get more granular, that's where some mistakes can kind of come through. And specifically, I think when it comes to those granular audiences, and it's a good point that you made earlier in terms of audience size, for the bigger brands, it's going to be easier to get those audiences to be approved because there is a size limitation that you have to have. So anything less than, like, I believe 2,000 exposures within the audience will not get approved. And so that's also another thing that we kind of have to tackle. And specifically with smaller brands, we have to keep the audiences a little bit more broad, just to make sure that we can actually implement them within the strategy.
Oh, got it. Yeah, that's a super important point. Cool. I'd love to shift over to customized reporting and analytics. I think that is one of the biggest benefits of using AMC is really understanding different reports like path to purchase, branded versus non-branded, etc. Can you expand a little bit, Jamie, on just what are those key AMC reports that you recommend every brand should
Mhm.
start with at a very high level?
Yeah, I would say at the highest level, overlap reports are the most important. And the most helpful to see that interaction between all the different advertising types. Specifically at Vendo, we'll use that to kind of paint the picture of, okay, what is DSP actually doing for us, and kind of how our whole ethos around DSP is it's not necessarily there to drive, day of conversion, but it's more there to supplement what you're doing on the PPC side. And so we see that time and time again through overlap reports where we can see a lift in purchase rate. On sponsored products, we might have a 1% purchase rate. And when DSP is involved in that pot, the purchase rate can come up. I've seen it as high as 10x, which is obviously super helpful to kind of paint that picture and to really show what DSP is doing for you as a whole. Otherwise, what I would say is using path to purchase report, which is a little bit more of a granular view there, and it actually kind of breaks up the overlap report by step. So we could see specifically from DSP to sponsored brands to sponsored products in that order, or like vice versa. And that usually helps inform optimization from a path perspective as well.
Got it. Yeah, I'd love to touch on that a little bit more. What are the most common paths to purchase you're seeing? Is there more of a standard you're seeing across the board? I'm sure that differs a little bit by category and also differs by what media brands are willing to run. But talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, almost in every case that we pulled, the most effective path are the ones that either end with sponsored products or end with low funnel DSP. And what's cool about those reports is we could see spend per path, which can also help with that optimization aspect. Something that we've been noticing on our accounts is a lot of spend ends up going from DSP conversion to DSP consideration, which is kind of the opposite of what we're trying to achieve there. And that's really helpful because we can obviously implement and pull certain levers to negate that spend as much as possible. And specifically within the DSP console, there are methods and audiences you can create for people who've been exposed to certain packages. So for us, like a consideration package, more mid funnel, conversion package, more low funnel, and we can make sure that we're kind of setting them on the right path and keeping it in that order from top to bottom.
Okay. No, that's super helpful. And then what are you seeing overall as far as the average path to purchase? Because I think a lot of times brands believe that the consumer is making the purchase in that second, which of course advertising as a whole shows us that that's not the case. But I would assume for consumables specifically that average path to purchase is going to be a bit shorter than what we're seeing across some other categories. Is that accurate, or what are you seeing overall?
Yeah, I would say that that's accurate. It really depends on the brand and the type of product you're selling. What I specifically look at is what's the average ad path. So are they going from sponsored brands to sponsored products, or sometimes what we see is people go from sponsored products to another sponsored products, for example. And that's something that we've been looking into pretty closely, specifically from a custom reporting perspective. What we've been doing is looking at the path from non-branded campaigns to branded campaigns, and we're finding that majority, if not most, of new to brand sales actually end on a branded campaign, which is pretty interesting. And I think it makes a lot of sense. And especially if you're a consumable, um, the first purchase might be from a non-branded campaign, but down the line, branded's going to
Mhm.
become more and more important, right? As people come back to repurchase. And even from a non-consumable item, I think a lot of times people do their research through the non-branded side, which makes a lot of sense. And then later in the week, a few days later, whatever it may be, they'll come back and purchase on the branded side. Um, and I think that's really cool because it's kind of showing that, branded's not just there for defensive strategies, it's also there for acquisition strategies too.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. Can you talk a little bit about the KPIs too that we're able to see on a branded versus non-branded level? Does that get as granular as add to cart rates, detail page view rates, purchase recency, things like that? Or
Mhm.
how are we looking at it as Vendo?
Yeah, so we can see all that. We can see purchase rate, and I think the most important thing that we look at is CAC. That's going to determine kind of where we're isolating our ad spend because obviously customer acquisition is probably the most important part of any Amazon business, especially if you're a consumable. And so that usually helps determine, how aggressively are we pushing towards certain campaigns, certain keywords, and how effective is it actually being in terms of bringing in new customers.
And is that able to look at just your ad attributed sales or your total sales for the brand?
Right. So that's mainly ad attributed sales. That's the thing about AMC. It's all going to be ad related. There actually is an upgraded feature, which we're just about to dive into, where we may be able to pull organic data as well. And I think that's huge specifically for vendor central brands where we don't really have a lot of access to that kind of data just naturally. So that's something that we're looking at. It's pretty exciting, but just in general, even with those vendor central brands, pulling those reports and being able to kind of reverse engineer organic repeat purchase rate versus organic CAC, we can do that a little bit, um, just not exactly 100% with our full capabilities right now.
Got it.
But it is something we're working on, and with the AI, it is making it more helpful to be able to pull those kinds of reports.
Got it. Cool. And then how are brands layering in some of their retail data and with their ad data? Are you seeing some synergies just as far as cross-channel management and marketing at all, or are we leveraging insights in retail at all through AMC?
Right. So historically, no. Historically, it has been very like Amazon e-com focused. But the nice thing about the AI, and it is one of the audiences that we're testing, and we're actually putting together case studies on this as well. So hopefully, we'll have a little bit more information in the next month or two, but we can look at kind of pot to purchase and retargeting from a different retail perspective. So, for example, we might be able to create an audience of people who did view through Google, through Target, and then retarget them on Amazon within that audience creation um, kind of feature that they've just implemented.
Cool. Yeah, that's awesome. And then what would you say as far as cadence for reporting? Is this something that you recommend brands are looking at on a monthly basis, or does that need to be more or less frequent?
Yeah, I would say monthly is probably best practice. I think the bigger the brand and the more, like I said earlier, those intense like upper funnel awareness campaigns, the more that you're running there, the more important it's going to be to look at AMC, especially for streaming TV, because we know that attribution is always a little bit um, iffy, on the streaming side. It's hard to get that exact conversion and lift data without AMC. So when we do run those types of campaigns, we're pulling those very frequently, probably bi-monthly or twice a month is what I meant to say. Otherwise, I would say if you're a smaller brand and you're not really diving too much into DSP, then it's not as important, but you can still get valuable data there. And especially from the audience creation side, what they've done on the AMC side now is we can actually use those audiences in PPC, which previously was not the case. And so even if you're a smaller brand and you're not running DSP, you're not running streaming TV, it's still helpful to have AMC because now we can utilize those audiences through PPC, which almost every brand should be able to do.
Got it. Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, speaking of the incrementality from some of the upper funnel tactics that you alluded to, what about video ads? What have we seen there overall? I know you talked a little bit about sponsored brands overall, but even a bit more mid funnel when you're just talking about video ads specifically on Amazon. How are we looking at incrementality, or what does path to purchase data show us traditionally around video advertising?
Yeah. So it's kind of the same story that we see through DSP. And it's also, like I mentioned earlier, when we look at like non-branded to branded campaigns, we also look at it from, sponsored brands video to sponsored products, for example. And we do see a very similar lift that we would see from like, sponsored products to DSP, where our purchase rate almost doubles, triples in most cases when we do run sponsored brands videos. And that's going to be kind of important for us to look at, especially when we test out different placements on sponsored brand video. Obviously, Amazon have implemented certain bid adjustments for different placements on sponsored brands, which is kind of a new feature. And so what we've been doing at Vendo is testing out, aggressive multipliers on certain placements there to see differences in performance and different KPIs come through. And then using AMC to tie that back, like how important is it for us to get on top of search with a video versus rest of search? And what is the difference in purchase rate there? And so far, I think kind of as we would expect, top of search is going to be more beneficial from a purchase rate perspective. But it's just a good example of kind of utilizing multiple different levers within Amazon and a lot of new features, which can get overwhelming at times, and really painting that picture from, an overlap report perspective.
Got it. Yeah, that's a great point. I'm curious too, just as far as what a majority of brands are focusing on, I'm assuming they're really honing their focus in on the converting customer. But I would also assume that there's a lot of value in looking at the non converting customer and audience specifically on Amazon, because that will give us more insight into maybe what's not working, where creative needs a refresh, etc. Are you seeing that as a highly valuable sort of thing that we should be diving into, is really looking at the non-converting audience as well, or are we focusing a majority of our time and effort on the converting audience?
hmm I would say majority of the focus is on the converting audience. From a non-converting audience perspective, as I mentioned, like not only in AMC are we utilizing, targeting features, but also negation features. So,
Yeah.
we can negate people who have clicked on PDPs multiple times and haven't purchased, right? Because at that point, we're kind of wasting spend and would rather hit new people. So definitely from a frequency perspective, we do a lot of negation, and from a click perspective,
Okay.
which kind of helps just solidify the whole strategy and make it as efficient as possible.
Perfect. And then my last question is, what do you feel is being overlooked in AMC, just as a whole, not here specifically at Vendo, but something that brands should dive into just as more low hanging fruit if they're running AMC themselves?
Yeah, well, definitely the templated audiences and the templated reports. I just think not that it's being underutilized, but it's just so easy to pull now. It probably takes 5 minutes to get that kind of report up and running. And I think a lot of people are kind of afraid because, they hear AMC, it sounds a little complicated. They think of queries and kind of assume they have to write code. But the way it works now is it's really easy and there's a quick turnaround to look at these types of reports, and to build out those audiences, which can be very high value. And so definitely recommend that if you're not utilizing AMC, or haven't looked at it in a while, take a look at it now, because it's a lot easier to pull in some key insights and to determine optimization strategies from those insights.
Awesome. Well, there's no better way than to end with that, Jamie. So I really do appreciate you coming on and just dropping all of this knowledge related to AMC for our audience here today. Was there anything else you wanted to close with?
No, I think that's good. Thank you for having me. Always excited to talk AMC. It's definitely, going to be a huge part of our strategy moving forward, if it's not already kind of the biggest part of our strategy. And I'm sure more and more brands are going to be opting in to see those types of analytics and audiences as well.
Absolutely. Totally agree. Well, always a pleasure, Jamie. And you can catch us in 2 weeks on Vendo Velocity. Hope everyone has a great week. Talk to you all soon. Bye, everyone.
Everyone.